The knight in Assassin's Blade was meant to find the Alpha King. It was not his finest warrior who saw it coming. It was her. The girl her own family had discarded like a spare piece on a chessboard, shipped off to a foreign court in her stepsister's place, arriving with a single trunk and a name no one had requested. She had read a personnel record 2 days before. She had noticed what everyone else overlooked. And when the moment came, she moved, quietly, without hesitation, without asking for credit. Calder Rhen survived that night because of a woman his enemies had never bothered to account for. What no one expected was what he did next. Why would the most powerful Alpha King in the North shield a girl his own court considered replaceable? And what did he see in her that her own blood never could? Watch until the end, because this story is not what you think it is. Drop a comment and tell me, did you see it coming? Chapter 1. The Morning They Gave Me Away. The morning they decided to give me away, my stepmother was, humming. I remember that detail with a clarity that still unsettles me. That soft, almost cheerful sound drifting through the stone corridor outside my father's study, as casual as birdsong, as though what was being arranged on the other side of that oak door was no more significant than a change of table linens. The sound of a woman who had already won. I did not stand with my ear pressed to the door like some frightened child. I was summoned. That was worse. My name is Elara Voss. I am 22 years old, daughter of Lord Aldous Voss of Greyvale, a cold territory in the northern lowlands, where the wind comes off the fjord 9 months of the year, and the remaining 3 are merely a gray rehearsal for the next winter. Daughter has always been a word used loosely in our household, tethered to me by blood alone and little else. My mother died when I was 5. I remember almost nothing of her, except a scent, something like crushed juniper and warm bread, and the impression of pale hair catching the slant light of a winter afternoon. I inherited that hair, the color of birchwood ash, almost silver when the light is right, the kind that draws attention in a crowd whether you want it or not. My stepmother Marta called it impractical. My stepsister Sylvain, who had glossy dark curls and the confidence of someone who had never doubted her welcome, called it ghostly. But she said it with a smile, which was always crueler than if she'd meant it harshly. Sylvain was the one who was supposed to go to Valdremor. Everyone in the 7 territories knew what the Alpha King's summons meant. Once in a generation, the King of Valdremor required a formal emissary from each noble house, a representative to serve at his court for an undetermined period. Some came back within a year. Some never came back at all. Not because anything terrible had happened to them, simply because Valdremor became their entire world, and the lives they had left behind shrank into something that no longer fit. Sylvain had been prepared for the honor for months. New gowns sewn from imported wool, lessons in court language, a carefully rehearsed way of lowering her eyes that was meant to suggest deference while still showing off her cheekbones. She had practiced it in the mirror. I had watched and said nothing. Then, 3 days before departure, she announced she was in love with Edric, a guardsman. An honest young man by all accounts, with kind eyes and no political value whatsoever. Sylvain wept with the dramatic devastation only she could produce. And Marta, who loved her daughter with the particular ferocity of a woman who had never been adequately loved herself, had gone to my father and said simply, "Find another way." My father, who had not looked directly at me in approximately 4 years, found the other way without much difficulty. I was called into his study at dawn. The fire had burned low. Marta stood beside his chair like a pillar, her gaze fixed somewhere above my head. A sealed document rested on the desk between us, the royal mark, a black wolf's head on deep burgundy, the wax already cold. "You leave Thursday," my father said. His voice had the particular flatness of a man who had already made up his mind and simply needed to say the words aloud to make them official. "You will represent Greyvale at the Alpha King's court. Try not to embarrass us." I looked at the document. I looked at him. I waited for something else. A reason, an apology, a softening of any kind. Nothing came. "May I bring my sword?" I asked, because the prohibition had never been stated, and I had learned young that the things people don't think to forbid are often the things most worth keeping. He didn't answer. He picked up his quill. I took the document from the desk and walked out. In the corridor, I passed Marta without speaking. She was still humming. The night before I left, I sat at my window and looked out at the frozen fjord below Greyvale, the ice black under a sky without stars, and tried to memorize the shape of a place I had spent my entire life not belonging to. A soft knock at my door. I opened it to find Sylvain. She didn't speak. Her eyes were red, but her hands were composed, clasped in front of her, and in one of them, something small and silver. She held it out. A hair clasp, shaped like a running hair, the silver worn smooth at the pin. My mother's. The one thing of hers I had never been given. I looked at my stepsister. For a moment she opened her mouth. Then she closed it. She lowered her eyes. She pressed the clasp into my palm, turned, and walked away without a sound. I stood in the doorway and held the cold silver until it grew warm in my hand. That was the only time I cried, once, briefly, in the dark, before I put the clasp in my pocket and went to pack my single trunk. Chapter 2. The Road to Valdremor. The carriage that came for me the following Thursday bore no Voss colors. It was dark wood, plain as a coffin, adorned only with the royal mark, and the driver spoke to me exactly once, to confirm my name, and then spoke no more. The journey north took 3 days, through landscapes that changed with the slow drama of a world unconcerned with human urgency. The cultivated fields of the lowlands gave way to ancient forest, black spruce and silver birch pressing close on both sides until the road narrowed to a thread. Then the forest thinned and the mountains began. Granite walls rising on all sides, the road climbing in switchbacks through the Calder passes, where the wind moved with physical intent, and the light turned the color of old iron. I read for the first 2 days. Everything I had thought to bring was inside my head already. Trade histories, territorial disputes, the genealogy of every noble family in all 7 territories. But there is a difference between knowing things in a library and knowing them in a moving carriage, 3 days from home, alone. I reviewed everything I knew about Valdremor and found the gaps in my knowledge sharper than I had expected. I knew Calder Rhen had become Alpha King at 26, 8 years ago, following the death of his father. I knew his father had been called difficult, which is the diplomatic word powerful men receive, when the truthful words would be, he ruled through fear and called it strength. I knew Calder had spent 8 years quietly dismantling that inheritance, without dismantling the structures that held his kingdom upright. I knew he was considered exceptional, for reasons that varied depending on who was speaking. His warriors said he was the finest blade in the north. His counselors said he was the most incisive mind in 3 generations. The women of court, according to rumor that traveled even to Greyvale's provincial halls, said simply, "You have to see him to understand." I had placed little value on that particular observation. I placed slightly more value on it now, 3 days from everything I had ever known, heading toward a court that had not requested me specifically, only my name on a document, a seal, a function to be filled. I was a replacement. On the second evening, the carriage stopped at a way station in the high Calder Pass, a low stone building with a single fire and a taciturn keeper who assigned me a narrow room with a window that looked straight down into a valley of blue-shadowed snow. I could not sleep. The cold pressed against the glass with patient persistence, and the silence was the kind that has texture, dense and alive, unlike the hollow silence of Greyvale, which had always been the silence of people choosing not to speak. I wrapped myself in my cloak and sat at the window and thought about Sylvain and the silver clasp and the thing she hadn't said. The trouble on the 3rd day began at dawn. We were an hour from Valdremor when the road narrowed through a boulder pass and the horses stopped. I heard the driver shout, then a sound that required no translation. The flat, percussive thud of wood on bone, and then silence where a man had been. I sat very still for one breath. Then I opened the carriage door from the inside and stepped out. There were 4 of them, lean, poorly armed, the look of men whose hunger had made a decision their survival was still arguing with. 1 held the driver's reins, 2 stood in the road. The 4th was watching the tree line, which told me he was the one with either the most experience or the most fear. I put my hand on the hilt of the short sword at my hip, the one my father hadn't forbidden because he hadn't thought of it, and said, clearly and without particular emotion, I am an emissary of the Alpha King of Valdremor. Whatever you are considering, I would encourage you to reconsider it very quickly. The one holding the reins looked at me. He looked at the sword. He almost laughed. Then the sound of hoofbeats reached us, rapid, plural, coming from the north, and every one of the 4 men looked up the road with the expression of people whose calculations had just become irrelevant. 3 riders materialized from the pass, like smoke given direction. The woman at the front wore the black armor of Valdremor's guard, a sigil of a running wolf over her heart, and she was already drawing her sword before her horse had fully stopped. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She simply looked at the 4 men in the road with an expression of such complete professional indifference that 2 of them took a step backward before she'd said anything at all. The encounter resolved in the time it takes a candle to burn down a finger's width. When it was over, the 4 men gone into the trees, the driver sitting up and swearing, my hand no longer on my hilt, the woman turned her horse toward me. She was perhaps 40, dark-skinned, close-cropped silver threading through black hair, with the bearing of someone who had given commands her entire life and found the experience agreeable. She looked me over with the frank assessment of someone reading a map for accuracy. Voss emissary? Elara Voss. Britta, captain of the Interior Guard. She studied the sword at my hip. You were going to fight them. I was going to make them reconsider. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. Your driver is alive. Your document is intact. We ride from here. The carriage will follow. She said it as a settled fact, not an offer, not a command. I mounted the horse one of her riders brought forward and didn't ask questions. The Calder Pass opened above us, and Valdremor waited on the other side, and I found, riding north through air cold enough to bite, that the fear I had been carrying quietly for 3 days had transformed into something else entirely, something that felt, uncomfortably, like readiness. Chapter 3. The Fortress at Night. Nothing I had been told about Valdremor was adequate. The fortress did not look built. It looked grown. Black granite rising from the mountain rock, as though the mountain had decided over 1,000 years to produce it. Towers reached the sky with the arrogant permanence of things that did not require human agreement to exist. Torchlight moved along the outer walls, even in daylight, constant, unblinking, like the pulse of something vast and unhurried. The ancient forest pressed close on 3 sides, the trees older than the fortress, older than the kingdom, their canopy so dense it turned afternoon light green and strange. Everything smelled of pine and cold stone, and that electric undertone that lives in the air before lightning, sharp, charged, unmistakably alive. We crossed the outer gate, then the inner gate, then a stone bridge over a river that ran the color of flint, and stopped in a courtyard where a dozen people stood waiting. Not servants. They held themselves the way people hold themselves when their bodies are simply the physical location of a great deal of competence. I stepped down from the horse and felt every pair of eyes in that courtyard find me simultaneously, not with hostility, but with the specific quality of attention that experienced people give to variables they have not yet categorized. Britta dismounted at my side and walked me through the outer entrance hall. Stone floors worn smooth by generations of boots. Walls hung with maps rather than tapestries, every one of them annotated in at least 3 different hands. This was a place that valued information over ornament, utility over display. I felt myself exhale for the first time in 3 days. "He'll see you in the morning," Britta said, leading me up 2 flights of stairs. "You have tonight to rest." She showed me to a room in the east wing, not servants' quarters, not the formal guest chambers reserved for visiting dignitaries. Something in between. A real bed, a writing desk, a fireplace that smelled of birch smoke, and a window that looked out over the inner courtyard, where the torches threw amber circles on snow-dusted stone. "The hall is on the ground floor. The library is in the north tower. 3rd staircase on the left. You'll find everything you need." She left. I stood in the middle of the room and listened to the fortress settle around me. The distant movement of guards, the low murmur of voices from somewhere below, the wind coming off the mountain and running its hands across the outer walls. I should sleep. I knew I should sleep. I could not sleep. I found the library by accident, at an hour when the torches had been reduced to embers. The North Tower staircase announced every footstep with a soft iron complaint, and I moved carefully, my candle casting a circle of light that reached perhaps 3 feet in any direction. The shelves curved along the interior wall in a great rising arc, volumes stacked deep and close, their spines worn to illegibility, their margins, when I tilted one open, dense with notation in ink of varying ages. This was not a decorative library. Someone here read seriously, possibly several someones. I found a chair at a table near the window, set my candle down, and opened the volume I had been carrying in my satchel since Greyvale, a trade history of the Northern Territories, dry as ash and twice as useful. I had been reading for perhaps an hour when I heard the sound. A page turning. Very slowly, without changing my expression, I looked to my left. He was seated at a table in the far corner of the room, in the shadow between 2 standing shelves where my candle's light did not reach. He had extinguished his own lamp at some point, or had been working in the dark before I arrived. He wore no cloak, no armor, only a shirt of undyed linen, the sleeves pushed to the elbows. And he was reading with the focused stillness of someone who had been here a long time and expected to stay longer. He looked up. The first thing I noticed was his eyes, storm gray, the color of the sky above the Caldmere Pass just before snow, and entirely without social cushion. He looked at me the way a man looks at a problem he has not yet decided is interesting enough to solve. The second thing I noticed was the scar crossing his jaw, old, silver pale, with the particular smoothness of a wound that had healed very thoroughly and very long ago. It gave his face an asymmetry that was not diminishment. It was, I thought, despite myself, exactly the right kind of flaw for a face like his. The third thing I noticed was that I had been looking for several seconds longer than was appropriate, and he was watching me do it. "You are the Voss emissary," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind that does not need volume to fill a room. "And you," I said, before I had decided to say anything, "are sitting in your own library at midnight." A pause. In the quiet, I became aware of how still the tower had gone around us. "Sit down," he said. "There is water on the side table." It was not invitation and not command. It was simply the most natural arrangement of the available facts. I looked at the water. I looked at him. Then I sat down, because refusing felt performative, and I was too tired to perform. We stayed like that for a long moment, the candle between us, the fortress quiet outside, the smell of old paper and cold stone, and something warmer underneath it all that I did not examine closely. "What are you reading?" he asked. I showed him the spine. He glanced at it with the expression of a man who has read something so thoroughly that its title now arrives pre-annotated. "The 3rd chapter has errors. The trade figures for Kelmark were transcribed incorrectly from an earlier source." "I know," I said. I corrected them in the margin. He looked at me then, genuinely, the assessment recalibrating into something more attentive. When? When I first read it, 3 years ago. Another pause. The candle threw slow shadows across his features, the jaw, the scar, the particular quality of his attention that felt less like being observed and more like being read. "Why were you not sleeping?" he asked. "Why were you not?" The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something that acknowledged the parry and chose not to press it. He looked down at his own book. "Come to the council meeting at first light," he said, without looking up. "Britta will show you where." I opened my mouth to ask why, whether this was protocol, whether I should be flattered or wary, whether this was a test or simply what he did with people he found unexpectedly in his library. He turned a page. I understood that the question had not been offered a window, so I closed my mouth and read until the candle burned low. And when I rose to leave, the tower staircase announced my departure with its iron murmur, and I did not look back. But I knew. The way you know a fire is behind you, even when you face the dark, that he watched me go. Chapter 4. The Council Table. I was the first to arrive. The council room was smaller than I had expected. A round table of dark oak, 12 chairs, windows on 2 sides filled with the pearl-gray light of a Nordic morning, and maps. Always maps. This place breathed cartography. 3 others arrived before the Alpha King. Oswin, the Lord High Steward, a broad man with a copper-streaked beard who assessed me with the practiced wariness of someone whose job it was to assess. Sigrid, who administered the eastern trade routes, and had the particular stillness of someone who has spent decades identifying problems before they became visible. And Rob, a young territorial liaison with a freckled face, tawny hair, and an expression of uncomplicated curiosity that I found, unexpectedly, disarming. He sat down next to me as though we had been placed at adjacent desks since childhood. "You're the Voss emissary," he said. "I heard you came in from the Caldmere last night. There was some trouble on the road?" "Briefly." "Britta mentioned you had your hand on your sword." "I had my hand on the situation," I said. "The sword was incidental." Rob looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone deciding they like a person. And then Calder entered the room, and everything adjusted the way everything always adjusts, around a force of gravity that has learned not to announce itself. He was dressed for work, dark leather over a wool undershirt, the same absence of ornament I had noted the night before, though now with the addition of a blade at his hip and the weight of the room settling visibly onto his shoulders the moment the door closed. He sat down, set a sheaf of papers on the table, and began without preamble. The morning's agenda covered a dispute over salt mining rights on the eastern border, not, as the presenting lord argued, a matter of resource allocation, but rather, as I understood it within 5 minutes of listening, a contest over who had the authority to set survival terms for an entire territory. 3 weeks of negotiation had circled the same impasse. I listened. I did not speak. The light moved across the table as the meeting progressed, and Calder ran it with an efficiency that had nothing performative in it. He cut to the operative question in every exchange, offered no superfluous words, and listened to the people around him with the kind of attention that made them sit slightly straighter. He did not look at me once. This was so conspicuous an absence that I understood it was deliberate. And deliberateness implies awareness, and I filed that away without examining it too closely. "The Eastern parties have rejected every proposed division," Oswin said, with the tone of a man who has explained this 12 times and is running low on diplomatic patience. "They will not accept terms handed down from Valdremor." "They are not disputing the salt," I said. The room went quiet. I had not planned to speak. The words arrived because they were true, and the silence was a window. And I have never in my life been able to leave a true thing unspoken when a window opens. "What did you say?" Oswin turned his full attention on me, with an expression that had not yet decided whether to be offended. They are not disputing the salt allocation. They are disputing the precedent. If they accept terms from Valdremor on resource rights, they are acknowledging that the Alpha King can set those terms unilaterally. That is what they are resisting. The salt is almost incidental. Silence. Sigrid had stopped writing and was looking at me with an expression I could not yet read. So give them the frame, I said. Not the substance, the frame. Let them co-author the language of the agreement. They will accept terms they would have fought to the last if those terms had been handed to them, because they will believe they made the decision themselves. People do not war against their own choices. A longer silence. That, said Sigrid, in a voice that carried the weight of 30 years behind it, is exactly correct. Oswin made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite resistance. The sound of a man recalibrating against his will. Rob was looking between me and the table, with the expression of someone watching a thing he knows he'll think about later. Calder had not moved. He was looking at his papers. And then, without looking up, "We'll implement the co-drafting approach. Oswin, arrange the meeting." He wrote something in the margin of the document in front of him. The meeting continued. Afterward, in the corridor, Rob fell into step beside me, with his customary absence of ceremony. "Oswin's been circling that dispute for 3 weeks," he said. "You arrived 12 hours ago." "It was obvious." "Obvious things," Rob said philosophically, "are usually the last things anyone says out loud." He glanced at me sideways. "I'm going to like you, Elara Voss." I found, unexpectedly, that I did not mind the idea. Chapter 5. The Hall and the Corridor. The other emissaries arrived that afternoon. There was Halvard, of Westfjord, a large man whose physical presence was clearly a strategy he had spent years perfecting, who looked at me with the comfortable condescension of a man who categorizes people by appearance before troubling himself with usefulness. There were twin brothers named Rolf and Gunnar from the Highland territories, who finished each other's sentences and treated the entire proceedings with a pragmatic cheerfulness I found immediately likable. There was Marit, of the southern coast, quiet as still water, who watched everything and showed nothing, and did not miss, I suspected, a single thing in any room she entered. And then there was Leontine. Leontine of Mornvale arrived, as though arrival were itself a performance. 3 trunks, a personal attendant, a gown the color of frozen sea at first light. She was beautiful in the way that a blade is beautiful, the form entirely serving the function. Her eyes were dark and sharp, and moved over the room with a speed that I recognized as intelligence operating behind a social surface. She looked at me once, a single comprehensive assessment, and then turned to Britta to ask about her room. I understood immediately that she had decided I was not worth her attention. I also understood from years of practice that this was the version of dismissal I preferred. People who overlooked you provided the best observation conditions. What I had not yet understood was that Leontine and Calder had a history. That came at dinner. The evening meal at Valdremor was communal, long tables in a hall that smelled of wood smoke and roasted venison, the easy noise of people who had eaten in the same room for years. The emissaries were seated at a table near the head of the hall, not at the main table where Calder sat with Oswin and Sigrid, and 2 others I hadn't yet learned, but close enough. Leontine had maneuvered herself into the chair with the clearest sightline to the Alpha King's table, and spent a portion of dinner arranging herself to be seen. I was watching Calder, not because I had decided to watch him, but because I had not decided to stop. He was deep in conversation with Oswin about something that required both of them to lean over the same document simultaneously. He was not performing authority, he was simply exercising it, the way a craftsman uses a good tool, directly, without ceremony, with the ease of long practice. Then someone laughed at the far end of the hall, and the sound broke whatever thread I had been following, and I looked up and found him already looking at me. Not at the table in general, at me specifically, with the same directness I had felt in the library, that complete absence of social buffer between his attention and its target. I did not look away. I don't know why. possibly because looking away felt like conceding something I hadn't decided to concede. Possibly because I was simply too startled to move. He held my gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he looked back at his document. The dinner continued. Halvard dominated the conversation at our table. Rolf and Gunnar ate with dedicated enthusiasm. Marette watched the room. Leontine set her cup down with a precise, particular sound, and when I turned, she was looking not at Calder, but at me. Her expression told me she had seen it, catalogued it, and filed it under something that would matter later. I looked at the fire and told myself it meant nothing. I almost believed it. After dinner, the hall thinned. I stepped into the corridor that ran alongside the great hall, wanting the quiet, wanting 2 minutes where no one required anything from me. The corridor was narrow. Torches in iron brackets, the smell of melting tallow and old stone. I heard him before I saw him. The measured cadence of a man who moves through spaces he owns, not with the noise of possession, but with the silence of something that simply belongs. He appeared from the cross passage and stopped 2 feet away, reading a letter that had been handed to him as he left the table. He did not look up immediately. He finished the letter, folded it, and then he turned to put it in his coat, and we were side by side in a corridor wide enough for 1.5 people. The warmth of him was immediate and unexpected. That much heat radiating through layers of wool and leather, in air that was otherwise cold stone all the way through. He didn't move to pass me. He didn't ask me to move. He looked at the letter for another moment, or gave the appearance of looking at the letter, and then, "You were not sleeping last night because you were anxious." "I was not sleeping last night because I was reading." "You were reading because you were anxious." I did not answer, because he was not wrong, and we both knew it. "The council meeting tomorrow," he said. "It concerns the northern border roads. You've read the relevant documents?" "I've read everything in the Eastern Archive that was available to emissaries." A brief pause. "The northern documents are in the restricted archive, second shelf from the left, on the 3rd floor. Britta's authorization is sufficient." He stepped past me. The warmth withdrew with him, like a tide pulling back from shore. "Good night, Elara Voss." He was gone around the corner before I registered that he had used my first name. I stood in the corridor for a moment, my palm against the cold stone, my heart doing something I didn't entirely sanction. And then I walked back to my room and spent a very deliberate half-hour telling myself the warmth in the hall had been from the fire, and the speed of my pulse was merely the natural result of an unexpected encounter in an unfamiliar place. Perfectly reasonable. Chapter 6. The Weeks Inside the Walls. 3 weeks passed. I measured them in the rhythm of Valdremor itself. The early council meetings, the long afternoons in the Northern Archive, the communal evenings that had begun to feel less foreign and more like the texture of how days were meant to end. The cold deepened as winter settled in properly, frost appearing on the courtyard stones each morning and lasting until past midday, the fjord valley below the mountain walls going hard and silver as hammered iron. I found my place in the fortress the way water finds its level, not by being assigned one, but by occupying the spaces that went unoccupied. The archive above the library, where trade records from 2 generations back were stored in wool-wrapped bundles, tied with leather cord, and mostly unread. The afternoon council sessions that Halvard consistently declined to attend because they were, in his view, administrative rather than consequential, and I thought precisely the opposite, which was proving to be the more accurate assessment. Rob found me on the 4th day, carrying a pot of tea he had brought from the kitchens, on what was clearly a deliberate detour, and thereafter brought tea approximately every other afternoon, which I understood was his way of conducting a friendship, and which I appreciated enough not to remark upon. He told me things in the unhurried way of someone who trusted that information shared between friends served a different purpose than information deployed strategically. The interior guard had a hierarchy based partly on rank and partly on a system of accumulated trust that had nothing to do with official standing. which was why Britta, technically a captain, carried more actual authority in the fortress than two of the counselors. Oswin had served Calder's father before Calder, and carried those 30 years of a different court in the careful, sometimes mournful way he watched the younger man make decisions the old king never would have made. Sigrid had turned down a territorial governorship twice to remain at Valdremor, which everyone knew and no one discussed, because everyone understood that her reasons were complex and private and did not require their speculation. And the king himself? I asked once, on an afternoon when the snow outside the archive window had gone to a heavy silence. Rob was quiet for a moment. He turned his teacup in his hands. On his left wrist, the old tattoo, the mark of Evenmore, a territory that no longer existed, that had been dissolved by order of the previous king, was visible above his cuff, faded to the color of old ink. I had noticed it on the first day. I had not asked. "He's been king for 8 years," Rob said finally. "Since he was 26. His father was." A pause. The diplomatic word is difficult. He looked at me. "You know what that means." I knew. He spent 8 years trying to build something different, without a model for how to do it. Most of the counselors who were there before are still there. You can't simply remove the past. You have to outlast it, which is exhausting, I said. Yes. Rob set down his cup. He carries it well enough that most people don't see the weight, but it's there. I thought about a man reading alone in his library at midnight, about the careful composure that didn't perform itself, but simply was, the way mountain weather simply is, present, constant, not arranged for any audience. "He's alone," I said, before I had decided to say it. Rob looked at me with the expression of someone recognizing something they had already known, articulated by someone who should not yet have seen it. "Yes," he said quietly. "He is." The snow outside continued its patient work, and I looked at the archive shelf and thought about nothing in particular, which was not at all what I was doing. One evening in the library, my library, I had begun to think of it that way, though it was not mine, though it was also increasingly his. I sat reading past the point where the room had gone fully dark except for my candle and the low fire on the lower level. I heard the stair. One set of footsteps, confident, unhurried. He came around the corner of the nearest shelf and stopped when he saw me. He looked at the candle, at the book in my lap, at the hour it clearly was. He went to the small cabinet in the corner without a word, produced a clay pot, and set it on the brazier. I watched him do this with the slightly disoriented feeling of someone whose expectations of the moment have been replaced by something simpler and stranger than anticipated. When the pot was hot, he poured it into 2 clay cups and brought one to the table beside me. He sat down across the table. He opened his own book. "What are you reading?" he asked, not looking up. "Territorial History of the Caldmere region. The author has an interesting theory about the original road systems." "The theory is wrong. The pass roads predate the settlements by at least a century." "I know, but the margin notes in this copy are more interesting than the text." He looked up at that. "Whose notes?" "I don't know. Whoever owned this before you." Something shifted in his expression, briefly, almost imperceptibly, like light moving across stone. "My mother's." The fire crackled. The candle threw slow shadows. I looked at the book in my hands with new attention. The careful script in the margins, observations precise and dry, and occasionally, quietly, funny. "She read everything," he said, after a moment, in the tone of someone placing something down, rather than displaying it. "Every volume in this tower has her notes in it. Some of them have notes on the notes." I turned to a page I had already read, found her handwriting in the margin. This author has clearly never actually traveled the Caldmere in winter, or he would not use the phrase "moderate terrain" with such confidence, and felt something in my chest shift in a direction I could not entirely name. "She would have liked you," he said, very quietly, not looking up. I did not know what to do with that. So I looked at the page and held it carefully and said nothing, which felt like the right response. When I finally rose to leave, reaching for the hair clasp that had come loose during the evening, I heard him say, without my having mentioned it, without any context that made sense of his knowing, "It fell to your left, by the chair leg." I looked. It was there. I picked it up and held the worn silver in my hand for a moment before sliding it back into place. He was watching the page he was reading, but he had been watching me first. Chapter 7. Halvard in the Corridor. The incident with Halvard happened on a Tuesday. I had been in the lower corridor near the map room, returning from the Eastern Archive with a bundle of trade records I had been cross-referencing against current border arrangements. Halvard was there with 2 men from his delegation, newly arrived from Westfjord, filling the narrow passage with the particular expansiveness of men who assume that spaces arrange themselves around them. He didn't move as I approached. I stopped. The corridor's geometry made waiting for him to pass the obvious and peaceable solution, and I was entirely prepared to simply wait. Until he looked at me, with the expression that some men reserve for women they have decided to find charming rather than relevant. The expression of indulgent tolerance. The expression of, "I see you, and I am being gracious about it." "The little archivist," he said with a broad smile. "Still carrying the king's papers for him?" "My own research, actually." He seemed to find this delightful in an unflattering way. "The Voss girl does her own research. Tell me, does knowing things help in a place like this?" "It has so far," I said pleasantly, and moved past him through the gap between his shoulder and the wall, which was narrow but navigable. His laughter followed me down the corridor, not unkind, which was somehow worse. The laughter of someone who has decided you are not worth real opposition. I turned the corner and stood against the cold stone with my jaw tight and my eyes forward, counting to 10 in my head, the way I had taught myself in my father's house. Then I breathed out deliberately and walked on. I did not know, would not know, until Rob told me that evening that Britta had been in the parallel corridor, that there was a connecting archway through which sounds traveled with architectural clarity, that Britta had heard everything, including the specific quality of silence before I answered. Britta told Calder. I learned this not from Calder directly, but from the fact that at the following morning's council session, Halvard received 3 consecutive corrections to his assertions about Westfjord's trade data. Corrections delivered without emphasis, without visible purpose, simply as accurate information placed into the record. And Halvard spent the rest of the meeting with the expression of a man recalibrating his sense of the room's composition. Calder never looked at me during any of it, but afterward, in the corridor, as the others filtered out, he fell into step beside me without announcement and said, "The notes on the Caldmere road systems. Have you reached Chapter 8? "Yesterday." "There's a discrepancy in the bridge measurements that becomes significant when you compare it to the current engineering records. The restricted archive, 3rd floor, 2nd shelf." He peeled away at the next intersection. I stood at the fork and watched him go and understood, with a clarity that arrived without warning and lodged itself somewhere I could not dislodge it, that this was how he paid attention. Not with declaration, with utility. Not with words, but with, "Here is information I thought you would want." Chapter 8. Snow and a Smaller Room. The storm arrived overnight without announcement. By morning, Valdremor was transformed. The courtyard buried, the outer walls softened at their edges, the forest beyond invisible behind a white curtain so thick it looked like the world had ended at 30 feet. The cold was extraordinary. Every fire, in every room, was working hard. And the air in the corridors carried the particular intimacy of a building buttoned shut against weather. The morning council was smaller. Oswin was confined to his rooms with a winter fever that Sigrid described as aggressively ordinary and therefore undeserving of sympathy. 2 senior guards were managing the logistics of a resupply that had been stranded below the pass. Rob had been sent to the lower gate before dawn, which left Calder, Sigrid, Murray, who had apparently been attending council sessions since the second week, her presence simply solidifying through consistent arrival. And me. Calder worked through 2 items without ceremony, and then set down his pen and looked at me with the directness that I had, by now, learned to read as simply the way he existed in rooms. No available setting between his full attention and its complete absence. "The salt dispute," he said. "The co-drafting language was implemented. They've agreed to meet. That's good. It worked exactly as you described. The logic was straightforward. The logic was available to every person who has been working on this for 3 weeks," he said. "None of them used it." I did not answer, because I had several possible answers, and none of them felt like what the moment was actually asking for. Sigrid turned a page she was not reading. "Why are you here, Elara?" he said, and the question landed differently than any version of it I had been braced for. Not suspicious, not procedural. Genuinely curious, in the way genuine curiosity sounds almost nothing like its imitations. "My family sent me in place of my stepsister. I know why the Voss household sent you. I am asking why you are here, what you want from it." Outside the windows, the snow moved in slow, deliberate curtains. The fire crackled. Sigrid turned another unread page. I thought about the archive, and the council mornings, and the weeks of learning the shape of a place I had arrived at involuntarily, and found, against all reasonable expectation, that I did not want to leave. I thought about Rob bringing tea, about Britta's economy of approval, about the library in the North Tower, where a man I had not expected to understand anything, read alone by a dying fire. "I want to be somewhere I can be useful," I said. "I don't have extensive experience with what that feels like, so I may be going about it clumsily. But that is what I want." A pause. "You are not going about it clumsily," he said. His voice had shifted by something small and nearly undetectable. Not softer exactly, but with one less layer between him and the words. Sigrid very quietly turned another unread page. Mirette looked out the window with the elaborate disinterest of someone exercising extraordinary restraint. Later that night, the snow still falling, the fortress wrapped in the particular hush of a world made smaller by weather, I walked the corridor back to my room and found myself stopping at the window that overlooked the inner courtyard. The torches had been shortened against the wind, their light reduced to amber coins in the white. I stood there for some time, looking at nothing, aware of a warmth at the center of my chest that had nothing to do with the stone walls or the fire in my room. "You are not going about it clumsily." 4 words, delivered without ceremony, by a man who did not say things he didn't mean. I closed my fingers around the silver clasp at my hair and went to bed, and did not sleep for another hour, which I chose not to examine too closely. Chapter 9. What Leontine Came to Say. She arrived at my door on a Wednesday evening, with the smooth intentionality of someone who had planned the visit and wanted it to appear spontaneous. Leontine sat in the chair by my fire. She had the ease of a woman who made herself comfortable in any space as a matter of strategy, and looked at me with those sharp, careful eyes that her social smile never quite reached. "You've made an impression," she said. "I've tried to be useful." "Yes." She tilted her head. "That is an interesting strategy. Different from what I would have chosen." The fire settled between us. I waited. "Calder and I," she said, without preamble, "were betrothed 3 years ago." I kept my expression arranged. The betrothal was his proposal. It was politically useful. I accepted it for the same reason. A pause. "It was dissolved 8 months later. By him." "I see. Do you want to know why?" "Only if you want to tell me." She looked at the fire for a moment. When she looked back, the social surface had been put down entirely, and what I saw beneath it was a woman of considerable intelligence, who had spent a portion of that intelligence on problems it had not been able to solve. "He would not let me past a certain point," she said simply. "Not through coldness, not through cruelty, but through something I could not name then and can name now only as the habit of being alone. His father governed through isolation. If no one knew what he was thinking, no one could maneuver against him. Calder was raised in that. He dismantled the politics of it, but not the instinct, I said. Not the instinct. She studied me. You are the first person I have seen him watch the way he watches you. He watches everyone. He observes everyone, she said. That is different. She rose, smoothed her skirts, moved toward the door with the unhurried grace of a woman who had said what she came to say. I am not warning you away. I am telling you that if you find that door, the one that goes past the point I reached, it will not open by waiting for it. He will not open it himself unless someone is standing on the other side. She left. I sat alone in the firelight for a long time, not thinking precisely about storm-gray eyes or warm wool in a cold corridor, or a voice that said, "You are not going about it clumsily, as though it were simply a fact needing to be placed in the record." Mostly not thinking about those things. Chapter 10. The Letter, and what Britta said. My father's letter arrived on a Thursday morning. I recognized the Voss seal before I recognized the handwriting. The pressed wax slightly uneven on the left side, as it always was, because my father had never bothered to have the die repaired. I held the letter in both hands for a moment before opening it, feeling the weight of the paper the way you feel the weight of something before you know whether it will hurt. It was brief. His letters were always brief. Sylvain is to be married to Edric in the spring. Marta is pleased. I am told you have acquitted yourself adequately in council matters. This is unexpected, but welcome. Do not overreach. A.V. I read it twice. Then I folded it along its original creases, set it on the desk, and looked at it from the particular distance of someone who has learned not to stand too close to things that wound. Unexpected, but welcome. The bar my father had constructed for me was so low that simply being described as useful by someone he respected was worth writing a letter. 22 years. One sentence. I found, sitting in that room in the north wing of Valdremor, with the winter light through the window and the smell of wood smoke in the air, that it hurt less than I had predicted. Not because the wound was not real, but because something had shifted in me over 6 weeks. Some expansion of the landscape in which I placed myself, and a wound that had once been the whole view was now only a portion of it. I put on my cloak and went to find Britta. She was in the outer training yard, overseeing a guard rotation with the focused efficiency she brought to everything. Snow had been cleared from the stone, but the cold was sharp enough to ache in the lungs. I stood at the edge and watched until she acknowledged me with a slight nod that meant wait, and I waited. When she came to me, her cheeks were flushed with cold, and her expression had the particular openness it took on between tasks. Not relaxed exactly, but temporarily unheld. You look like you received bad news, she said. Ordinary news. That's almost the same, sometimes. She looked at me steadily, and I found myself telling her about it. The letter, my father, Sylvain and Edric, and the arrangement that had deposited me here. The specific texture of growing up in a house where your presence was a courtesy no one had requested and no one wished to revoke, because revoking it required more effort than tolerating it. Britta listened the way she did everything, completely, without interruption, without the careful social empathy that is only empathy at a distance. My husband left when my son was 6 months old, she said, when I had finished. Not with bitterness. Not with the performance of strength that people adopt when they want you to know they survived something. Simply as a fact offered in exchange. He found he preferred a life that had more room in it. I went back to work the next day. A pause. People who leave us tell us something true, not about our worth, about the limit of theirs. I thought about that for the rest of the walk. Chapter 11. The Night of the Knife. The crisis came on a Friday evening, as crises tend to arrive, without dramatic preparation, in the middle of something ordinary. The evening meal was underway, the hall warm with firelight and the unhurried noise of people who had eaten together through a winter. I was seated at the emissaries' table, half listening to Rolf describe the Highland Spring Festival with detailed affection, when something caught my attention at the edge of my vision. A man standing near the side passage. Not a guard, he wore a cloak that suggested a traveler, and he had been part of the delegation that had arrived that afternoon from Ashgard with Wulfric Dorn, Calder's cousin, who had come for the quarterly territorial review with 3 trunks and a great deal of surface cordiality. The man in the passage had a name I had read in a personnel record 2 days ago. Sir Aldrich Hayne, listed as a member of Wulfric's retinue under the category of personal attendant, which was the kind of vague designation that told you nothing, except that the person who filed it didn't want you to look closely. What I had noticed about Hayne, 2 days ago, was that he had been released from the Alpha King's own guards 6 months earlier, for reasons the record described as administrative restructuring, which was also the kind of language used when the real reason was considered impolitic to document. What I noticed now was where he was standing. The side passage connected to the corridor Calder used after every evening meal. It was the right angle for someone waiting rather than passing through. I stood up. Rob looked up from his plate. "Elara?" "In a moment," I said. I moved around the table's edge, keeping my body between Hayne's sightline and my destination, and stopped at Britta's shoulder, where she stood at the hall entrance in her customary post. "Hayne?" I said quietly. "Side passage. He was dismissed from the Interior Guard 6 months ago. He is listed in Wulfric Dorn's delegation as a personal attendant, which means his purpose here is unofficial. He is standing in the only position from which the king's evening route is observable without being obvious." Britta did not look where I indicated. She did not change expression, but her hand, resting at her side, closed slightly. "Go back to your table," she said. "Finish your meal." 3 minutes later, a senior guard appeared in the hall entrance and spoke quietly to 2 others. Calder was drawn from his table on the pretext of an urgent correspondence, departed through the eastern corridor, and was not in the side passage when Hayne moved. I learned the rest in pieces, from Rob, who learned it from the duty logs, which he had access to and had apparently decided to read with some urgency. Hayne had been stopped in the king's study corridor with a concealed blade. He had not been alone. A second man had been posted in the lower courtyard. Both were now in the fortress cells. When I learned this, I was sitting in the library. It was past midnight. The fire had burned to embers, and the snow outside the window had stopped. And the silence was the kind that arrives after something has shifted and is still finding its new shape. The stair announced a visitor. Calder came around the shelf corner and stopped when he saw me. He looked at my face for a long moment, then sat down across the table, in the chair that had become, over weeks, simply his chair. "You read Hayne's personnel record," he said. "I read every personnel record in the public archive. 2 days ago. The records are filed by date of last update. His had been updated 8 days ago. A recently updated record for someone with no formal role in an incoming delegation is worth reading closely," he finished. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted. Outside, the fortress held its breath. "You have been here 6 weeks," he said. "You have read every available record. You remember all of it. And you notice the things that don't fit. I have always done that. I spent my childhood reading things I wasn't supposed to be reading, in a library no one thought to lock, because the prohibition itself seemed suspicious." Something moved in his expression that I was beginning to learn. Not warmth exactly, because it was not performative enough to be warmth. Something prior to warmth. Something that recognized without announcing the recognition. "Your father's letter came this week," he said. I looked at him. "Everything that comes through Valdremor's gates comes to my attention," he said simply, not apologetic, factual. "He described you as unexpected. By his measure, that is high praise." "Yes," I said carefully. "I am aware of his measures." "Then you should also be aware," he said, and his voice had shifted again. That subtle dropping of one layer, The thing I had begun to listen for, the way you listen for a specific instrument in an orchestra. That how you came to be here has no bearing on what you are. What you are is someone this court would have been significantly worse equipped without. That is, I began. A factual statement, not a diplomatic one. I opened my mouth and closed it. I looked at the embers in the grate. I don't know what to do with that, I admitted, quietly, in the way I admitted things when I was too tired or too moved to be careful. Neither do I, entirely, he said, with a candor that surprised me enough that I looked up sharply. He was looking at me, not with the assessment I knew, not with the careful attention of someone cataloging information, but with something that sat much closer to the surface, something that had been there, I understood in that moment, for longer than either of us had been willing to name. But I find, he said, that uncertainty is not the same as doubt. The door opened and Oswin appeared with a report from the cells, and the moment folded itself quietly away, like a letter along its creases. But it stayed with me through that long night, through the sound of footsteps in the corridor, and the wind coming off the mountain, and the fortress settling around its occupants, carried against my sternum like a warm stone, like a small bright thing in the dark. Uncertainty is not the same as doubt. Chapter 12. The Binding. The meeting with Wulfric Dorn took place the following morning. He arrived for it with the smooth cordiality of a man who had left difficult rooms successfully before, accompanied by 2 members of his delegation, and the careful openness of someone whose guilt was so neatly arranged he had nearly convinced himself it was innocence. Calder received him at the round council table rather than the formal receiving hall, which was itself a message, and Wulfric's brief eye flicker at the choice told me the message had been received. Oswin was present. Sigrid was present. I was present, which Wulfric noted with a glance so dismissive it nearly arrived as an insult, without technically qualifying as one. Calder did not accuse. He laid the documented sequence on the table. Haynes' dismissal from the guard, his inclusion in Wulfric's delegation, the corridor, the blade, and invited his cousin to explain the coincidences. He did it without heat, without visible anger, which I had learned was not the same as absence of feeling. With Calder, the absence of display was itself a language. Wulfric was good. He had a counter-narrative prepared, plausible at its surface, and he deployed it with the practiced ease of a man who had told a version of this story in the mirror until it sounded natural. He went on for 7 minutes. Calder let him. Then Calder looked at me. I had been sitting quietly with the documents I had brought from the archive, not Haynes' personnel records, which everyone had already discussed, but something older. A series of property inquiries filed with the Northern Land Registry over the past 18 months, each one asking about road access rights through the mountain passes north of Ashgard. Each one filed under a slightly different name, slightly different entity. Each one, if you read them together, pointing at the same eventual destination: control of the primary trade route between the northern territories. The 6th document, I said. The inquiry filed under the Thornwall Company. It was filed the same week that Haynes' dismissal from the guard was processed. If Haynes' dismissal was Wulfric's action, rather than administrative routine, then the timing is not coincidental. The inquiry went in when the plan was already in motion. Removing a piece from the guard was preparation, not consequence. The room was quiet. Wulfric looked at me with an expression that had moved past dismissal into something considerably less comfortable. "Who," he said, with a flatness that was not quite a question, "is this?" "This," said Calder, quiet, final, carrying something that was not anger, but held all of its weight, "is Elara Voss. She is my Chief Advisory Counsel for Territorial Intelligence." A pause. Deliberate. The length of a blade being placed on a table. Answer her point. Wulfric could not. He attempted 2 redirections that Oswin systematically and, I noted, somewhat enjoyably dismantled. By the end of the hour, he had withdrawn from 2 property inquiries, accepted a formal review of his delegation's activities, and agreed in writing to present a full accounting of the Thornwall Company's shareholders to the council within 30 days. He left Valdremor before dinner. When the chamber had emptied and only Calder and I remained at the table, he picked up the stack of land registry documents and looked at them for a long moment. "When did you find these?"
3 days ago. I wasn't certain they were relevant until last night.
"You read the Northern Land Registry for leisure." "I read everything in the archive. I don't always know what I'll need until I need it." He set down the papers. He looked at me with the expression I had learned to recognize as him making a decision, not deliberating, not weighing, but arriving at the end of a process that had been running somewhere underneath the surface and was now simply complete. "Chief Advisory Counsel," he said. "I said it to Wulfric without asking you." "Yes." "Would you have refused it?" I thought about my father's library, entered without permission because the prohibition was suspicious. About 22 years of noticing things in rooms that didn't want me in them. About a fortress in the north where, for the first time in my life, noticing things was not merely tolerated, but had twice now changed the shape of events. "No," I said. "I know," he said. "That is why I didn't ask first. I did not want to give you the opportunity to argue yourself into a smaller space than you occupy." I looked at him for a long moment. "You do that," he said. "Talk yourself smaller than you are." "You do something similar," I said, because honesty had become our working language, and I saw no reason to depart from it. "You carry this fortress as though sharing the weight would diminish your ability to hold it." He was still. "It wouldn't," I said. "It doesn't." The fire in the grate, the maps on the wall, the quiet that had accumulated between us over 6 weeks. Not the hollow quiet of Greyvale, not the silence of people choosing not to speak, but something that had its own substance, its own warmth, that existed because of us, rather than in spite of us. "My father," he said, with the deliberateness of a man placing down something he has carried a long time, governed through isolation. If no one knew what he was thinking, no one could move against him. It worked, after its fashion. He also died in a room with no one in it who genuinely knew him. I know. I have spent 8 years trying to build something different, without a model for it. "You have Oswin," I said. "And Sigrid. Britta." "Yes," he said. His eyes found mine across the table. "And now I have you." Chapter 13. The Window. In spring. Spring came to Valdremor the way it always comes in mountain country, grudgingly, then all at once. The emissaries departed over the course of 3 weeks in early thaw. Halvard returned to Westfjord with a revised trade agreement, his systematic dismissal of me replaced by a careful, mostly unspoken respect. The kind that comes from watching someone do something you could not have done, and being practical enough to update your assessment. Rolf and Gunnar left on the same morning, already planning their return visit to the logistics team who had adopted them with uncomplicated warmth. Murray departed silently, leaving only a folded note for me that read, "You see more than you say. Keep doing both. M." Leontine came to find me the evening before her own departure. She sat across from me in the library, our second conversation alone, bookending her time in Valdremor as neatly as a chapter, and looked at me without the social surface, which made her younger and more real and considerably more formidable. "You didn't maneuver," she said. "I watched you for 2 months. You simply were what you are, and it worked better than anything I planned." "I only know how to pay attention," I said. Something moved across her face, quiet, self-aware, the expression of a woman who is genuinely intelligent and has spent too long applying that intelligence to the wrong problems. "Then perhaps that is what I came here to learn, even if I learned it by watching someone else." She left the next morning. I watched her carriage move through the outer gate from the library window and felt something settle in me. Not triumph, not relief. A kind of respect. She had been exactly who she was the entire time. That was more than most people managed. Rob stayed. This surprised no one, least of all Rob himself. He had been given a permanent post, which he accepted with the unceremonious pleasure of someone who has found the place they fit and considers the finding sufficient recognition. On the morning it was announced, Calder had spoken to him privately, in the small antechamber off the council room. I was not present, but Rob told me afterward, with a quietness unusual for him. He said he knew about even more, Rob said. He said he knew it happened because of his father's orders. And he said, he looked at his cup. He said there was nothing he could do to undo it, but that I was here because I chose to be here, not because he'd given me permission, and he wanted that to be clearly understood. I told him, yes, sir, Rob said, which is the shortest thing I have ever said in response to something that required that kind of response. I thought about that for the rest of the day, about the weight of inheritance, about what it means to carry the damage of the person before you, and choose, nonetheless, to try to build something different. About the kind of man who finds it necessary to say, "You are not here by my permission," to someone who had never asked for it. My father came to Valdremor once, in late spring. He arrived for the formal territorial review, each pack lord required to present in person, according to the protocol Calder had instituted, in place of the old custom of written reports. He arrived with the composure of a man who had received word through official channels that his daughter held a formal advisory post at the Alpha King's court, and was still in the process of incorporating this information into his existing understanding of the world. He was shorter than I remembered. That is the strange arithmetic of returning to people you have outgrown. We spoke briefly in the corridor after the formal session. He stopped beside me with the particular stillness of a man who had prepared a posture for a situation and found the situation unrecognizable. "You look well," he said. "I am well," I said, genuinely. He looked around the corridor, the maps, the worn stone, the purposeful movement of people who knew exactly where they were going and why. His expression shifted through something private. "They value you here." "Yes." A pause that held many things neither of us would say, because some distances don't close completely, and that is simply the shape of them. "Good," he said. "That is good, Kate." My name, for a moment, the one only he used, then, Elara, correcting himself, looking briefly uncertain. "Both are fine," I said, because they were. He left 2 days later. I watched the Voss carriage move through the outer gate from the library window and felt something settle that had been unsettled for a very long time. A door that had stood open for years, not quite slamming, not quite locking, but closing, softly, into its frame. The formal appointment came on a morning in late spring. The council chamber was full, Oswin and Sigrid, and Britta and Rabba the senior guard, the assembled territorial representatives who had stayed through the quarterly review. The valley below Valdremor had gone green, visible from the windows as a living thing, the forest shedding its winter severity for something more generous. Calder stood at the head of the table and spoke about the winter, the salt dispute, the Dorn matter, the intelligence work that had shaped the court's decisions over the past 3 months. He spoke about the role of territorial intelligence in Valdremor's governance. He spoke about the gap that had existed for years between the information available and the capacity to read it. And then he looked at me, from across the table, and for just a moment, in front of everyone in that room, there was nothing armored in how he looked at me. "Elara Voss," he said, "has served this court with a quality of insight and integrity that I am formalizing today as permanent. The position of Chief Advisory Counsel, a role that has not previously existed in this court because the specific capacity she brings to it has not previously existed here," Oswin said, with the deliberate weight of a man who had spent 30 years in this court and was choosing his next words with care. "I would like to note, for the record, that I argued against the framing approach she proposed in the first week. I was wrong. It is the first time in 30 years I have been wrong about a council matter, and I consider the caliber of the person who corrected me to be adequate justification. Sigrid made the sound she made when she agreed with something and found agreeing with it deeply satisfying. Rob was already grinning, had been grinning since the moment Calder began speaking, and made no effort to correct this. Britta, at the wall beside the door, inclined her head. The slow, deliberate acknowledgement of someone who had formed her assessment of me on a mountain road months ago and found nothing sense to revise it. Afterward, when the chamber had emptied and the morning had moved into the corridors and the practical concerns of a living territory, Calder came to the window, the south window, the one that overlooked the valley. I was already there. The valley was extraordinary in the spring light, green and vast, and spreading into distances the eye couldn't hold. The fjord a silver thread far below. The sky the pale blue of something just washed clean. The sun was low enough to cast long light across the stone floor of the room, pooling warm around our feet. We stood side by side in the way we had learned to stand, the way that had accumulated gradually, without ceremony, one evening at a time, until it had simply become where we were when we were in the same room, and the room offered a window. "Well," he said. "Well," I said. Outside, a hawk crossed the valley on a thermal, its wings open, unhurried, describing a slow spiral above the green. "I came here because I was sent away," I said after a while. Quietly, not performing it, simply placing it there, in the space between us, because it was true, and because truth was what we spoke to each other. The one no one wanted. I arrived with a single trunk and a letter that was already sealed, and a name no one here had requested. He turned slightly, and I felt his attention shift from the valley to me the way you feel sunlight move. "And now," I said. I turned to face him. He was already looking at me, not at the valley, not at the appointment documents we had left on the council table, at me, with the same quality of attention that had been there from the first night in the library. Direct, complete. The kind that doesn't know how to be partial. "Now I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," I said. The space between us was the distance of two people who have been standing side by side for months and have simply, finally, acknowledged which direction they are both facing. He raised his hand and tucked a loose strand of hair back from my face, carefully, with the particular care of someone handling something they have decided has value. His thumb rested at my temple for a moment. "I would like," he said very quietly, "to stop governing as though what I want is separate from how I govern." "They are separate questions," I said. My voice came out lower than intended. "Yes," he said, "which means the one does not preclude the other." I looked at him, at the jaw, the scar, the eyes that were storm gray in ordinary light, and something warmer now, something that I had no word for. And I put my hand over his where it rested at my temple and held it there. "I know," I said. "I want to be here." "Then stay," he said. Plain, complete. Nothing more than that, and nothing less. Outside, the hawk completed its spiral and resolved into something purposeful, moving north along the valley with the unhurried certainty of a creature that knows exactly where it is going. Inside, Valdremor went on. Rob reorganizing the archive with cheerful tenacity. Britta running her guard rotation with her son at her heels on a half-day free. Oswin and Sigrid arguing with the comfortable ferocity of people who have disagreed productively for decades and would not have it otherwise. I had arrived here as a replacement, a name on a document, an inconvenience rerouted. I stayed as myself, fully, finally, without qualification or apology. The silver clasp at my hair caught the spring light as I turned back toward the valley, and Calder's hand was warm against mine, and the world outside the window was green and open and entirely unhurriedly ours. End. She had arrived like winter, uninvited, necessary, and impossible to look away from once you understood what she carried. Valdremor Series, Book 1, The Unwanted One.